Most Canadians have no accurate sense of where they stand financially relative to everyone else around them. They compare themselves to friends, co-workers, and social media feeds, none of which are representative samples, and come away either falsely reassured or unnecessarily discouraged, depending on who happened to be in the frame. This video gives you 5 specific, sourced benchmarks, real Canadian data, that tell you whether you are actually ahead of the average Canadian financially, regardless of what your income is, what city you live in, or what your peers appear to be doing. Some of these will surprise you. Being ahead of average in Canada does not require a 6-figure income, a paid-off home, or a massive investment portfolio. It requires specific financial behaviors that the majority of Canadians, documented in surveys and Statistics Canada data, are simply not doing. If you are doing them, even imperfectly, you are almost certainly further ahead than you think. What the average Canadian looks like here, a 2024 survey by the Canadian Payroll Association found that approximately 47% of Canadian workers said they would find it difficult to meet their financial obligations if their paycheque was delayed by just 1 week. A separate BNN Bloomberg/Angus Reid survey found that more than a third of Canadians have less than $1,000 in accessible emergency savings. These are not fringe findings. They are consistent across multiple independent surveys, and they paint a picture of the majority of Canadian workers living paycheck to paycheck with little to no financial buffer. What being ahead of this looks like, the commonly cited benchmark for an emergency fund is 3 to 6 months of essential living expenses, rent or mortgage, food, utilities, transportation, held in a liquid, accessible account, such as a high-interest savings account or a TFSA holding cash or money market funds. By this standard, a Canadian with even 2 to 3 months of expenses set aside in an accessible account is already ahead of a documented majority of their peers, regardless of their income level. Why this specific sign matters more than it sounds. An emergency fund is not just a financial cushion. It is the structural difference between a financial setback that is inconvenient and one that is catastrophic. A Canadian without an emergency fund who loses their job, faces an unexpected car repair, or has a medical expense is forced into high-interest debt to cover the shortfall, setting off a debt cycle that then works directly against every other financial goal. A Canadian with 3 months of expenses saved absorbs the same shock without derailing any other part of their financial picture. The specific benchmark: if you have more than 1 month of essential expenses in an accessible liquid account right now, you are ahead of a documented plurality of Canadian workers. If you have 3 months or more, you are ahead of the large majority. What the average Canadian looks like here, according to Equifax Canada data, the average Canadian carries approximately $21,131 in non-mortgage consumer debt, credit cards, car loans, lines of credit, and buy now pay later balances combined. Credit card balances specifically have been rising, with the average Canadian credit card balance reported above $4,200 in recent periods, frequently carrying interest rates of 19.99% to 24.99% annually. At 20% annual interest, a $4,200 credit card balance costs approximately $840 per year in interest alone, money that generates zero return and builds no wealth for the person paying it. What being ahead of this looks like: a Canadian with no outstanding credit card balance carried month to month, no payday loans, and no high-interest personal loans is in a meaningfully stronger financial position than the documented average, regardless of whether they have a car loan or a mortgage, both of which are typically lower interest, asset-backed forms of debt that behave differently from revolving consumer credit. The specific benchmark, If you pay your credit card balance in full every month and carry no high-interest consumer debt, you are ahead of a significant, documented share of Canadian borrowers. The interest rate at which a debt crosses into high-interest territory worth prioritizing is generally considered to be any rate above the long-run average expected return on a diversified equity investment. Typically, anything above approximately 6% to 7% annually represents debt, where paying it down produces a better guaranteed return than the expected investment return, making it the financial priority. What the average Canadian looks like here. As of the most recently available CRA data, while the large majority of eligible Canadians have opened a TFSA, the average TFSA account holds a balance well below the cumulative contribution room available. And a significant share of TFSA holders hold their balance in cash or low-interest savings products rather than invested in equities or funds. A 2023 survey found that approximately 50% of Canadians report having no investments outside of their home and employer pension, if they have either at all. The TFSA was introduced in 2009. A Canadian who opened a TFSA in 2009 and contributed the maximum every year has up to $109,000 in cumulative contribution room as of 2026. The median actual TFSA balance is a fraction of this. What being ahead of this looks like: a Canadian who has any amount invested in a low-cost equity ETF inside a TFSA or RRSP, even $100 per month into XEQT or VFV, is ahead of the documented majority of Canadians who either are not investing at all or are holding savings in cash equivalents that do not participate in long-run market returns. The specific amount is less important than the fact of being invested. Because, as the compounding mechanics covered elsewhere on this channel demonstrate, the earlier and more consistently an investor is in the market, the larger the long-run outcome. The specific benchmark: if you have any balance currently invested in equities or equity funds inside a registered account, and you are making regular contributions to it, you are ahead of a documented majority of your age cohort in Canada. What the average Canadian looks like here. Statistics. Canada's Survey of Financial Security shows that the median net worth of Canadian families varies dramatically by age. But across the working-age population, a meaningful share carry negative or near zero net worth after accounting for all debts against all assets. The median net worth for Canadians under 35 was approximately $48,000 in the most recent survey, heavily skewed by home equity for those who own, and significantly lower or negative for those who rent and carry consumer debt. More tellingly, net worth growth, the year-over-year change, is flat or negative for a significant share of Canadians whose spending increases match or exceed their income growth. What being ahead of this looks like: a Canadian whose net worth, total assets minus total liabilities, is measurably higher at the end of this year than it was at the end of last year is, by definition, building wealth. The specific dollar amount is less important than the direction and consistency of the trend. A renter with $15,000 in invested assets and $5,000 in student loan remaining, whose invested assets grew to $22,000 while the student loan dropped to $3,000, has increased their net worth by $9,000 in a year. A genuinely strong result regardless of the absolute level. The specific benchmark: calculate your own net worth right now. Add up every asset: TFSA balance, RRSP balance, savings, car value, any property, and subtract every liability: mortgage remaining, car loan, student loans, credit card balances, any other debt. Then compare it to the same calculation from 12 months ago. If the number is higher, even by a small amount, you are building wealth. If it is flat or declining despite a reasonable income, the earlier signs in this video explain why. What the average Canadian looks like here. A 2023 Financial Planning Standards Council survey found that only approximately 30% of Canadians have a written financial plan. A separate survey found that the majority of Canadians have no clear target for how much they need to save for retirement, no specific timeline for when they want to be financially independent, and no defined savings rate they are working toward, meaning the large majority of Canadians are improvising their financial lives, spending what arrives, saving what remains, and hoping it works out. What being ahead of this looks like. A Canadian with even a basic, simple financial plan, a defined savings rate they are working toward, a TFSA and slash or RRSP they are contributing to regularly, a rough target for their emergency fund, and an understanding of the accounts they are using and why is ahead of the approximately 70% of Canadians who have none of these things defined. The plan does not need to be a formal document written by a financial advisor. It needs to be a set of specific, intentional decisions about what you are doing with your money and why, that you return to and update over time. Why this sign is the multiplier for all the others. An emergency fund without a plan to build it gets depleted and not rebuilt. Investments without a plan get cashed out when the market drops. Debt freedom without a plan gets replaced by new debt. The plan is not just another item on the checklist. It is the mechanism that makes all the other signs durable rather than temporary. The specific benchmark. If you can answer these three questions right now, what is your current savings rate? What are your registered accounts? And what is in them? And what is your approximate net worth? You have more financial self-awareness than the documented majority of Canadians. And that self-awareness is the foundation every other financial behavior in this video is built on. Let's bring all five together. Sign 1. You have an emergency fund. Nearly half of Canadian workers couldn't handle a one-week paycheck delay. 3 months of expenses in a liquid account puts you ahead of the documented majority. Sign 2. You have no high-interest consumer debt. The average Canadian carries over $21,000 in non-mortgage consumer debt. Paying your credit card in full every month and carrying no high-interest balances puts you ahead of a significant share of Canadian borrowers. Sign 3. You are actually investing. Approximately half of Canadians have no investments outside their home and employer pension. Any amount invested in an equity ETF inside a registered account puts you ahead of roughly half your peers. Sign 4. Your net worth is growing. Direction matters more than the absolute level. If you finished this year with a higher net worth than last year, at any dollar amount, you are building wealth, which is more than a significant share of Canadians with flat or declining net worth trends can say. Sign 5. You have a plan. 70% of Canadians have no written financial plan. Knowing your savings rate, your accounts, and your approximate net worth puts you in the top 30% by financial self-awareness alone. None of these require a high income. None require a paid-off home. None require a perfect financial life. They require specific, documented financial behaviors that the majority of Canadians, by the data, are simply not doing, which means if you are doing them, even imperfectly, you are almost certainly further ahead than you think.